Hello everybody. Today I would like to talk to you about my green and white vanilla deck. This deck was created as an experiment. This is not the first time I have tried that. Last year I made a similar deck, but I didn't have some of the key cards, such as grizzly bears, and I decided to restart this experiment this year, and I should say it was more or less successful. The idea of this deck is that in old school we have got very powerful answers and very good utility cards such as mana acceleration and drawing engines. I think it's hard to argue with that, but we definitely have some of the weaker threats by modern standards. So I wanted to see if it was possible to create a more or less viable and semi-competitive deck using only vanilla creatures. As you can see, the only text you see on these cards is the flavor text. And the answer is yes. I think that the experiment was rather successful. I have managed to make this deck and to defeat some of the opponents that were playing semi-competitive decks. Sometimes I would say that the win rate for this particular deck was a little bit higher than my typical janky decks, and I'm really happy about it. So let's talk about this deck. Let's talk about what it includes. We are going to start with the mana base. Of course, there are 4 savannas, there are 4 cities of brass. We definitely want to have a lot of colored mana very early. We also have 8 plains. This deck needs a lot of mana. We have more plains than forests because we want to have savanna lines turn 1. If it's possible, we want to make sure that we can sword our opponent's creatures. So that's why you have only 7 forests. There is also a Black Lotus, of course, which we always want to have very early and maybe even a bit later in the game. This deck is mana hungry very often. You've got the 2 Moxen in the correct colors. There's also a Strip Mine, just in case our opponent has something powerful such as Library of Alexandria. You know that I'm not a fan of including Sol Rings in every deck, but in this deck it's definitely justifiable. Just look at how much mana we have got in the casting costs, how much colorless mana is really needed. Now, before we go to the tasty stuff, which is the vanilla creatures, let's talk about the answers. We definitely have very good answers in white. We have got the best removal card, arguably, Swords to Plowshares. We have got 2 Disenchants. As you notice, I don't have the sideboard in this deck because I didn't really bring it to a tournament just yet. Maybe I will remake it. Maybe I will add 1 more color. Guess which one? Because this was a rhetoric question. You understand which color I'm talking about. So there is a Disenchant, again only 2 copies, but maybe I will bring more, especially if I had the sideboard. There's also Balance. Balance is a little bit questionable here. You understand that we often will have more creatures than our opponent, and casting Balance would mean losing our creatures, but after a board wipe, this can definitely be a good and viable strategy. 1 more non-creature card that we've got is Sylvan Library. Of course, I would usually like to have 3 Sylvan Libraries, not 2. This is the standard I use, but I had to make rooms for some important creatures such as Squire. So that's why we only have 2 Sylvan Libraries. But they definitely won me a game, more than 1. And even more relevant was Army of Allah. Your opponents very often don't expect that. This can double the damage that you are going to deal if you are attacking with a bunch of grizzly bears or similar creatures. So that's definitely an incredibly powerful card. Very often killing your opponent's big creatures, and they blocked your creatures, not expecting that you would be able to almost double the damage. So a very good card. I only have 2 copies. I'm not sure whether the 3rd copy would be justifiable or not. I believe that 2 copies are actually good and fine. There is 1 light and 1 dark version, I believe. These are different versions. So yes, a very good card in this deck. Now let's talk about creatures. The only creature that can be considered playable and a staple is Savanna Lions. All other creatures are pretty much janky. 7 lines, of course, we understand how good they are. 2/1 drop, and for a very long time this card was considered too powerful and was never reprinted. Later on they started to reprint it. At first it was just a reprint with a different art, not as gorgeous as this one, I believe. And also later on they started to add something, but this was much later. So 7 Alliance, definitely very good. Squire is perhaps the most miserable card in this deck, and 1/2 for 2 mana. I've got nothing else to say. This is definitely a card I included for humorous effect. Grizzly Bears. Grizzly Bears, a card so famous that it gave a name to the whole subclass of creatures. Grizzly Bear is something which is 2/2, typically for 2 mana, vanilla. There's no abilities. Is it a good deal for old school Magic? Maybe it would be a good deal if there were no Mishra's Factories, but playing this against Mishra's Factories, playing this against White Knights, Black Knights, Pump Knights, if you are playing with Fallen Empires, this is definitely not a card that you will see very often. We've got another playset of Grizzly Bears from a different neck of the woods. We have another Grizzly Bear, which technically is not a Grizzly Bear because it costs 3 mana. Only 1 copy. A very beautiful card. I definitely like the picture here. Slightly better are Keepers of the Faith, because they have got 3 toughness. 3 toughness. Now, toughness very often seems irrelevant in many matchups, because we think of cards as the cards that deal damage. We think of creatures as damage dealing cards. We don't think of them as blockers very often, but we understand that toughness is not only relevant in the blocking situation, it's also relevant in the situations where you want to attack. Will you trade with another creatures? So I believe that toughness is very often ignored, and this is probably not the best decision. Well, many cards just have the same power and toughness. They are symmetric, so to say, but if they are not, of course, very often we would prefer high power. So, of course, lightning ball lightning, I mean, 6/1 is good, 1/6 wouldn't be as good. But if you look at the case of, for instance, Idwin Ifrit, which is 3/6 for 3 mana, we definitely like that. So I think that, yes, toughness is important, even if you are attacking. I didn't get to talk about the boars. 4/4, I don't know. It's somewhere in between. I like the picture, I like the flavor text from the Bible. Not anything you're going to see nowadays, definitely. So, very interesting as a card itself. Ironroot Treefolk. There is also a flavor text, which I had never read before somebody pointed it out. And if you read it, you will not see this card in the same way again. Much better than Ironroot Treefolk is Moss Monster. 6 toughness. 6 toughness is amazing. It can block Juzamjin. It can block pretty much every playable creature in old school Magic and not die itself. So amazing, very powerful. Doesn't have flying. That would have been nice. But still, I wanted to say that yes, for 5 mana, 3/6 is very good. And it is definitely better than having a card with 4 toughness but 4 power. So incredibly good. We've got Jasmine Boreal, a very beautiful card. This is just such a pleasure to look at. The character and these North Star, I believe, the moon, all the atmosphere. I like this card a lot. In terms of power, it is simply an Urnam Djinn without any drawbacks. 1 extra mana, but we definitely can use it. Crowworm is an infamous card, believed to be very powerful by many in the past. Sadly, it has only a 4 toughness. Would I prefer it to be, let's say, 5/5? I'm not sure. Probably yes. It doesn't have any evasion. This is the problem. Very late in the game, your opponents will be able to block it, maybe with a couple of first strikers, and all of this 6 toughness would go to waste. Hence, there is only 1 copy. There is also Obsidian's Golem. I believe that this is actually the same word as obsidian, just in a different spelling, a different variant of actually the same name, if I'm not mistaken. I always had some trouble with this particular word. Didn't really understand what it was about. If you look at it, it is so dark. It's not only on the camera, but the card itself, it's very hard to make out the numbers here and the text outside of the text box. So for 6, really like the picture. 6 toughness matters, as I have already said. Believe me, this is a card that your opponents will fear. It sounds strange, but it is so. I believe the only drawback is that it's an artifact, so it will be easier to kill, but this is still a rather nice and powerful card. So this is the deck. Again, as I said, maybe I am going to revisit it, but I believe that the colors are right. What am I going to add? I believe that I'm going to add Armageddon. Some people have suggested this. I believe that this can be a right decision to make. And maybe there will be an extra color, as I said, to make use of some of the utility cards and so on. Then, of course, we would have to get rid of such glorious cards as Squire, the Unicorn probably, and a couple more cards that were just added here for the sake of completeness. But I believe that I have included all white and green and also artifact cards that are vanilla creatures. Maybe I have missed something. In that case, please let me know. Anyway, this was a nice experiment. I really want to emphasize that we shouldn't be afraid to experiment, to brew. Of course, it always feels bad when you are brewing a deck. You are playing, let's say, 10 games in a row and you lose all of them. This wasn't the case with this deck, as I said. So if you have a huge card pool, don't be afraid to experiment, because seeing all the same cards again and again can be, of course, fun for people who are very competitive, but I believe that there is much more to that in old school Magic. So hopefully I will revisit this idea of vanilla deck, and I would like to thank you for watching. Again, if you have got any ideas regarding that, please let me know. This would be very nice to discover with you. See you next time. Bye.